The war in Europe was collapsing. Roads were choked with wounded soldiers, abandoned equipment, and medical units desperately trying to escape the front. Among them were German Red Cross nurses, exhausted beyond imagination, marching on blistered feet and carrying stretchers long after their strength was gone. Many had not slept in days. Some had not eaten properly in nearly a week, and when they finally reached American lines, they braced for anger, for punishment, for humiliation. Instead, something they didn't expect happened. Stay until the end to learn what these German nurses told American officers in their first hours of captivity, and why it was one of the most heartbreaking moments of the entire war. The collapse, spring 1945. The German military was disintegrating. Hospitals that once held hundreds were now overflowing with thousands. Nurses, many barely in their 20s, worked non-stop through bombardments, smoke, and chaos. They changed dressings in muddy barns. They carried amputees on makeshift stretchers. They lived on watery soup and whatever bread the retreating units left behind. One nurse later recalled, "We had stopped counting days. We only counted how many men we could still save." But even that hope collapsed. As American and British forces swept across Germany, entire medical units were cut off, surrounded, or abandoned. Some nurses marched until their legs gave out. Others were discovered in field hospitals with no electricity, no bandages, and no food left to give wounded soldiers who begged for water. By the time American troops reached them, many of the nurses were trembling from exhaustion, the moment of surrender. When the nurses finally surrendered, most expected something terrible. They had been told the Allies would punish them, mistreat them, or worse. Some of the women were crying before a single American had even spoken to them. Others held their hands up slowly, terrified. Some pleaded, "Please end our suffering," not to beg for mercy, but in fear of what would await them in captivity after seeing the raw brutality of the war. And then nothing happened. No shouting, no threats, no anger. Instead, American medics immediately asked, "Are you wounded? Does anyone need help? Can you walk?" For nurses who had spent months treating the dying while starving themselves, this simple compassion was overwhelming. One American soldier looked at the group, saw how thin they were, and said, "Get these women to the medical tent." Now some of the German nurses broke down in tears right there, their first meal in days. Inside the American aid station, the nurses were given something they had not seen in ages. Clean water, fresh blankets, real medical supplies, and food. The Americans did not know that many of the nurses' stomachs had shrunk from hunger. They simply brought them hot stew, boiled potatoes, and bread. Some of the nurses refused at first. They truly believed they were not allowed to touch Allied food. Others tried to hide pieces of bread under their coats, thinking they must save it for later, because surely this was all they would receive. When an American medic noticed this, he gently told them, "You don't need to hide the food. There is more." For several nurses, that sentence was too much. The fear, the hunger, the relief, it all came at once. They cried openly while eating for the first time in days, a shocking discovery. Soon after, the Americans took them to a proper medical station, and this moment would change the way these nurses saw the world. For months they had worked with shortages, old needles, worn bandages, morphine saved for the worst cases, and operations done with almost nothing. The American station was the opposite. Sterile surfaces, cold metal instruments, fresh gauze stacked in boxes, enough medicine for everyone. One nurse later said, "We could not understand how an army could have so much. We had nothing." Another whispered, "Your wounded are lucky." For the first time since the war began, they were surrounded by order instead of chaos, by supplies instead of shortages, by calm voices instead of artillery. The transformation. Over the next days, the nurses changed rapidly. Their faces filled out. They slept like they hadn't slept in months. They no longer trembled when spoken to. Some even laughed for the first time since the war began. American medics were surprised at how skilled many of the nurses were, despite the terrible conditions they had worked under. In return, the nurses were shocked by how respectfully they were treated. One of them told an American sergeant, "You treat us like human beings." We were not expecting that. After the war, in time, the nurses were transferred to internment centers, questioned and later released, most without charges because they had simply been medical staff doing their duty. Many returned home to ruins, hospitals destroyed, families gone, a nation unrecognizable. But some never forgot those first moments in American custody. The food, the blankets, the kindness, the relief. This is a true World War II story because sometimes there is always a possibility that even in history's darkest moments, a flicker of humanity can survive. The days that followed were unlike anything the German nurses had experienced during the war. They were moved to a larger processing center where hundreds of other prisoners were being held. But the nurses were separated and given their own quarters, clean barracks with actual beds, not the muddy floors or hay bales they had slept on for months. Some of the women simply stared at the mattresses, unsure if they were allowed to lie down. An American officer noticed their hesitation and said, "These are yours. Rest." That night, for the first time in what felt like years, they slept without the sound of artillery in the distance, without the screams of wounded men, without the fear of being bombed while they worked. Just silence. And for many, that silence was harder to bear than the chaos had been. Because now, in the quiet, they had time to remember everything they had seen, everything they had lost, the faces of soldiers who died in their arms, the children they couldn't save. One young nurse named Greta sat on her bed and whispered to herself, "Is it really over?" She had been 17 when the war started. Now she was 22 but felt decades older. Her hands still shook when she tried to hold a cup of water. Another nurse, Margaret, had worked in a field hospital near the Eastern Front. She had seen things that no human should ever witness. Frostbite so severe that fingers fell off. Soldiers with wounds so infected that the smell alone made her gag. She had learned to turn off her emotions, to become mechanical in her work. But now, in this American camp, surrounded by kindness instead of cruelty, those emotions came flooding back. She cried every night for a week. The Americans didn't understand at first. They thought perhaps the nurses were being mistreated by other prisoners or that they weren't getting enough food. So they assigned a translator, a German-American soldier named Private Fisher, to speak with them. Fisher sat down with the nurses one evening and asked them directly, "What do you need? How can we help?" The nurses looked at each other, unsure how to answer. Finally, one of them, a woman named Ilse, spoke up. "We need to know what happened to our families." Fisher nodded slowly. He explained that Germany was in ruins. Many cities had been bombed beyond recognition. Communications were down everywhere. It would take time to find information about their loved ones. But he promised to try. Over the next weeks, Fisher became a bridge between the nurses and their past. He helped them write letters, searched through Red Cross records, and asked other prisoners if they had information about specific towns or regions. Slowly news began to trickle in. Some of it was good. Greta learned that her mother and younger sister had survived and were living with relatives in Bavaria. She wept with relief when she heard. Others were not so fortunate. Margaret discovered that her entire family had been killed in an air raid. Her parents, her two brothers, her grandmother, all gone in a single night. She stopped eating for 3 days. The American medics were concerned, but Margaret told them through Fisher, "I have nothing left to live for." It was another nurse, Anna, who brought her back. Anna had also lost everyone. Her husband had died on the Eastern Front. Her children had been evacuated to a city that was later destroyed. But Anna told Margaret something that would stay with her forever. "We are still here, and as long as we are here, we can honor them by living, by remembering, by refusing to let the war take everything from us." Slowly, Margaret began to eat again. She began to talk again, and eventually she began to smile again, though it would be many years before that smile reached her eyes. Meanwhile, the American medical staff continued to be amazed by the skills these German nurses possessed. Despite having worked with almost nothing, they knew techniques that some American medics had never seen. One nurse showed them how to sterilize instruments using limited resources. Another demonstrated a method for treating shock that she had learned in the field. The Americans took notes, they asked questions, and the German nurses, for the first time in years, felt valued for their knowledge rather than just being cogs in a war machine. But not everyone in the camp was kind. Some American soldiers were angry. They had seen the concentration camps. They had liberated towns where civilians had been massacred, and when they saw German prisoners, even nurses, they saw the enemy. One soldier spat at Greta as she walked past. Another shouted insults at Ilse, calling her a Nazi, even though she had never been a party member. The nurses learned to keep their heads down, to avoid eye contact with certain soldiers. But there were also moments of unexpected connection. One day, an American medic named Corporal Davis was treating a wounded German POW when he collapsed from exhaustion. He had been working non-stop for 36 hours. Ilse, who was nearby, immediately rushed to his side. She checked his pulse, loosened his collar, and elevated his legs. When Davis woke up a few minutes later, he saw Ilse standing over him with a concerned expression. "You saved me," he said in broken German. Ilse smiled sadly. "We are all just trying to save each other." That moment changed Davis. He began to see the German nurses not as enemies, but as fellow medical professionals who had been caught in the same terrible war. He started bringing them extra rations, medical books in German, and even small luxuries like soap and writing paper. Other American medics followed his example. Slowly, a strange camaraderie developed between the captors and the captives. They shared stories about their training, about difficult cases they had handled, about the horrors they had witnessed. And in those conversations, the walls between them began to crumble. One evening, a group of American and German medical personnel sat together around a small fire. One of the Americans asked, "Did you know about the camps?" The question hung in the air like smoke. The German nurses looked at each other. Some had heard rumors. Others had seen things that didn't make sense at the time. But most had been so focused on saving lives in their hospitals that they hadn't questioned what was happening elsewhere. Margaret spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "We heard stories, but we didn't want to believe them. And we were afraid to ask questions." An American sergeant nodded slowly. "Fear is a powerful thing." Another nurse, Hannah, added, "We were told we were saving Germany, that we were heroes, but now..." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Now they knew the truth. They had been serving a regime that committed unspeakable atrocities. And even though they had been saving lives, they had still been part of the machine. That guilt would follow many of them for the rest of their lives. As weeks turned into months, the nurses began to adapt to their new reality. They established routines. They helped in the American medical tents, treating both Allied soldiers and German POWs. They learned English phrases. They even began to laugh occasionally, though the laughter was always tinged.